The scent of splintered pine and damp earth hung in the air where my cabin once stood. It wasn't a storm that did this, nor a fire. It was an HOA, armed with a bulldozer and a grudge over a few $100s in disputed fees. They had sent letters, of course, filled with threats and legal jargon, but I never imagined they would go this far. This cabin was more than just wood and nails, it was a legacy, a sanctuary built by my grandfather's hands, a place of memories for a family that quietly served this country. They thought they were making an example of me. They thought they had all the power. But they never bothered to find out who they were really picking a fight with. For me, peace had a physical form. It was a two-story cabin nestled among towering pines, overlooking a lake so clear it mirrored the sky. My grandfather, a man who believed in the strength of his own two hands, had built it piece by piece over a decade. He'd taught me the language of wood, the scent of fresh-cut cedar, the smooth grain of oak, the rugged texture of pine. He left me the cabin, but he gave me the skills to preserve it. My life was a quiet one, spent in the workshop he'd built out back, carving custom furniture, feeling the legacy of his craft flow through me. The cabin wasn't a house, it was an anchor. It was the only place my family could truly be themselves. My father was a man of few words but immense presence. He spent his life in public service, a career shrouded in confidentiality that left lines of quiet intensity etched on his face. My sister, much the same, possessed a mind so sharp it was almost intimidating, her work taking her to places she could never discuss. Our family was built on a foundation of discipline and a sworn duty to the country, a commitment that was as unspoken as it was unbreakable. When they came to the cabin, they shed the weight of their responsibilities like a heavy coat. We would spend evenings by the fire, the silence comfortable, the tension of their outside lives melting away in the warm glow. Here, my father wasn't a stoic figure of authority, he was just a dad, skipping stones on the lake with me. My sister wasn't a strategic genius, she was the girl who still laughed at my terrible jokes. The cabin was our sanctuary, the one place on earth we were truly off the grid, insulated from the world we were all, in our own ways, sworn to protect. The Whispering Pines community had always been a loose collection of families who valued privacy as much as we did. For years, the Homeowners Association was little more than a formality, a group that organized the annual 4th of July barbecue and ensured the main road was plowed in winter. But things began to change. New money flowed in, bringing with it sprawling modern homes that dwarfed the older cabins. With the new residents came a new attitude. The HOA, once a casual committee, was professionalized. It was incorporated, bylaws were rewritten, and a new president was elected, a man named Arthur Harrison. Harrison was a retired executive who moved to the lake for the view but brought his boardroom aggression with him. He walked the neighborhood with a clipboard and a measuring tape, his smile thin and condescending. He saw the community not as a collection of homes, but as an asset whose value needed to be maximized. My first interaction with him was unsettling. He'd stopped by while I was repairing the porch railing, his eyes scanning the cabin with a look of distaste. He called it excessively rustic and suggested that a modern coat of gray paint would improve its conformity with the community's evolving aesthetic. I politely told him I preferred to honor my grandfather's original design. He just nodded slowly, making a note on his clipboard. A few weeks later, the first official letters began. They were small things, at first. A notice that my woodpile was stacked a few inches too close to the property line. A warning that the gravel on my driveway wasn't of the approved shade. Each letter was a small, irritating poke, a reminder that we were being watched. I complied, not wanting to cause trouble, but the sense of peace I cherished was beginning to erode, replaced by a low hum of anxiety. The real trouble started with a crisp white envelope labeled Community Enhancement Assessment. It was a bill for $2,000, a fee levied on every homeowner to fund the construction of a new brick and wrought iron gate at the entrance of our simple gravel road. The letter was vague, citing a vote taken at a meeting I had never been informed of. The amount wasn't the issue, it was the principle. My family had taught me to respect rules, but to question authority that refused to justify itself. I wrote a polite email to the HOA, requesting a copy of the meeting minutes, a breakdown of the construction bids, and the official vote tally. I believed in transparency. Mr. Harrison and his board, it seemed, did not. The response I received was a single, curt sentence: payment is due within 30 days to avoid penalties. I replied again, restating my request for documentation. This time, there was no reply. Instead, a week later, another envelope arrived. Inside was the original bill, this time with a $500 late fee and a new line at the bottom, typed in bold red letters: failure to remit payment will result in further action to protect the community's interests. I stood on my porch, looking out at the calm lake, holding a letter that felt less like a bill and more like a declaration of war. The red ink on that letter was the start of a slow-burning siege. I decided then and there that I wouldn't fund my own harassment. My response was not to ignore them, but to engage directly. I researched the state laws governing HOAs and found the statutes requiring them to maintain open records and announce board meetings to all members. The next scheduled meeting was a Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. I arrived 10 minutes early, armed with a folder containing my correspondence and a list of pointed, respectful questions. The clubhouse was dark. A small, laminated sign was taped to the door: meeting rescheduled and relocated due to scheduling conflict. There was no new time, no new location. It was a deliberate, calculated move to shut me out. I tried talking to my neighbors, the older ones who remembered the community as it was. They'd offer sympathy in hushed tones, glancing nervously toward the road. They'd all received their own petty notices, and fear was a more powerful motivator than principle. The new residents, Harrison's allies, were a different story. They saw my rustic cabin as a blemish on their pristine investment, and my defiance as a threat to their property values. I was alone in this fight. With my attempts at dialogue stonewalled, the HOA's campaign of aggression intensified. The thin, white envelopes began arriving not weekly, but almost daily. Each one was a new violation, a new fine, a new testament to their pettiness. I was fined $50 for improper mailbox maintenance, because the post had a slight, weather-beaten lean. I was fined $100 for unapproved flora, because my mother had planted a patch of wild daisies by the porch 20 years ago. My workshop, my place of peace and creation, became a source of constant infractions. A $200 fine for commercial activity in a residential zone landed on my doorstep, followed by another for a daytime noise ordinance violation, even though I was only using a hand sander. It was clear Harrison and his board were walking the perimeter of my property, actively hunting for infractions. They were building a paper trail, burying me in fines they knew I would never pay because they were absurd. The psychological toll was immense. The friendly wave of the mailman now brought a spike of anxiety. The sight of Harrison's golf cart patrolling the road made my jaw clench. They had poisoned my sanctuary. To escalate their pressure, they hired a private security company. A white SUV with an amber light bar began parking on the gravel road just at the edge of my property line. The guard, a stern man who never smiled, would just sit there for hours, his gaze fixed on my cabin. Sometimes, I'd see the glint of a camera lens. They were documenting everything, trying to intimidate me into submission. It was during this time that I spoke with my father. I laid out the stack of violation notices on the rough-hewn dining table my grandfather had built. He looked at each one, his expression unreadable but his silence heavy. He didn't offer advice. He simply listened, his gaze hard and distant. My sister's reaction was different. On a call, she was sharp and analytical. She had me email her every document, every photo, every timeline. She didn't speak of anger, only of strategy. "Don't respond to them anymore," she commanded, her voice calm and level. "Just keep a record. A perfect record. Every letter, every sighting of the security car, every conversation with a neighbor. Log it all. We build our own file." Her confidence was a small island in my sea of frustration. The HOA's assault then shifted from my habits to my history. Harrison, in his hunt for leverage, set his sights on the old wooden dock my grandfather had built. It was made of reclaimed lumber, weathered and imperfect, but it was the place I'd learned to fish, the place my entire family had gathered on hot summer afternoons. An official notice arrived, declaring the dock in violation of a newly minted bylaw, one that specified precise materials, dimensions, and setbacks that no existing structure could possibly meet. The letter was an ultimatum: tear it down within 30 days or the HOA would hire a contractor to do it and bill me for the demolition, along with administrative fees. This was no longer about money or rules. This was a personal attack on my family's legacy. They weren't just trying to control me, they were trying to erase me. The helplessness I had felt began to curdle into a cold, hard resolve. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I would not let them touch that dock. With the threat of demolition hanging over me, I sought legal help. I found a lawyer in the city who specialized in property disputes. He reviewed my file, the mountain of fines, the dock ultimatum, and the HOA's refusal to provide documentation. Initially, he was confident, citing state laws they had clearly violated. But a week later, his tone changed. He had dug into the HOA's recently amended covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the document I was bound to by owning property in the community. Harrison's board, with their majority of new resident votes, had pushed through changes that were draconian. They had granted themselves sweeping powers, including the right to remove any non-compliant structure without the homeowner's consent, and the authority to place a lien on a property for unpaid fines exceeding a certain amount. My bill, with all their fabricated fees, was well past that amount. You have a case, the lawyer told me, his voice weary, but it's the case they want you to have. They'll bury you in legal fees. They have the HOA's war chest to fight with, and you just have your own pockets. It's a war of attrition, and they're betting you'll run out of money before they do. The sliver of hope I'd been clinging to vanished. The system was rigged. I let the 30-day deadline on the dock notice pass in silence. I didn't tear it down, and I didn't respond. I just kept documenting, just as my sister had instructed. The day after the deadline expired, the final envelope arrived. It was thicker than the others. Inside was a formal lien notice. They had officially placed a legal claim against my property for the sum of $9,750 in unpaid assessments, fines, and penalties. The document was filled with dense legal language, but the message was brutally clear. This was the final step before foreclosure proceedings. They were going to take everything. My grandfather's legacy, my home, my family's sanctuary, all of it, gone. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hand, feeling the full weight of my powerlessness. Just as I read the final, threatening sentence, a low, deep rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. It was a sound that didn't belong in the quiet serenity of the lake. I looked out the window, past the trees, and saw it. A massive yellow bulldozer, its engine churning out diesel smoke, was crawling down the gravel road. Behind it was Harrison's golf cart and the white security SUV. But they weren't turning toward the dock. They were heading straight for the cabin. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted from the porch, my phone recording, my voice raw with a mix of disbelief and fury. The bulldozer didn't stop. It lowered its massive steel blade, chewing into the soft earth of my front yard, leaving grotesque tire treads where wild daisies had grown moments before. I stood in its path, a fragile, human wall against a ton of indifferent metal. Harrison pulled up in his golf cart, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. He held up a sheaf of papers, the lien, the bylaws, waving them like a royal decree. "This is association property now," he shouted over the engine's roar. "You are trespassing. Security, escort him off the premises." The uniformed guard, a man twice my size, stepped in front of me, his hand resting on something holstered at his belt. He didn't touch me, but he didn't have to. I was powerless. Forced to the edge of my own property line, I could only watch. The first impact was a sickening crunch that seemed to echo in my bones. The corner of the blade caught the porch, and the railing I had just repaired splintered into 1,000 pieces. Wood that had stood for 50 years was ripped apart in a single, violent second. Then came the glass. The blade rose and slammed into the large picture window overlooking the lake. It shattered with a sound like a gunshot, and the beautiful, placid view was suddenly jagged and broken. With every new act of destruction, a piece of my history vanished. The wall where my father had marked my height as a child. The floorboards where I'd taken my first steps. The roof that had sheltered my family for generations. I felt a rage so pure and white-hot it threatened to consume me, but beneath it was a profound, soul-crushing grief. Harrison was laughing. He was actually laughing, filming the destruction on his own phone, narrating his victory for his board members who had gathered at a safe distance to watch the spectacle. He wasn't just demolishing a building, he was reveling in the destruction of a man. And then, they appeared. Down the long gravel road, where the new brick gate stood as a monument to Harrison's ego, a procession of vehicles came into view. They were out of place in our quiet community, a line of 5 identical, black SUVs, their tinted windows hiding any hint of who was inside. They moved with a silent, coordinated purpose that was instantly unnerving. Harrison's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a scowl of annoyance. He yelled at the demolition driver to keep going, irritated by the interruption. The SUVs didn't slow down. They pulled into the area one by one, methodically boxing in the bulldozer, the security vehicle, and Harrison's golf cart with practiced efficiency. The engines cut out, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of splintered wood from the wounded cabin. Doors opened in unison. Men and women in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged. They wore earpieces and moved with a calm, disciplined authority that made Harrison's hired security guard look like a child playing dress-up. The lead vehicle's passenger door opened, and my sister stepped out. She was not the sister I knew from quiet nights by the fire. This was a different woman, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury, her eyes sweeping over the scene with a prosecutor's analytical gaze. She walked right past Harrison, ignoring his sputtering questions about who she was, and came directly to me. She put her hands on my arms, her eyes searching mine, her only question a softly spoken, "Are you hurt?" I just shook my head, unable to speak. From the second vehicle, my father emerged. He surveyed the wreckage of the cabin, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of deep pain in his eyes before it was replaced by a look of absolute steel. He walked toward Harrison, his stride unhurried and deliberate. The HOA president, puffing his chest out, stepped forward to meet him. "I don't know who you people are," Harrison began, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and bravado, "but this is private property. I am the president of this HOA, and I order you to leave immediately." My father stopped a few feet from him and simply stood there, letting the smaller man exhaust his bluster. When Harrison finally fell silent, my father spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the tension. "My name is Robert Miller," he said, "and I am the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He gestured toward my sister. "This is my daughter, Catherine Miller, a lead prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The color drained from Harrison's face. His jaw went slack. He looked from my father, to my sister, and then to me, the connection finally snapping into place in his mind. Before he could form a word, my sister stepped forward, holding a thick file. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice devoid of any emotion, "in your amateurish attempt to run this community like a personal fiefdom, you have broken a rather impressive number of state and federal laws." Local and state police cars, which had been part of the convoy, were now pulling up, their lights flashing silently. My sister didn't look at them. Her eyes were locked on Harrison. "We have evidence of wire fraud, related to your scheme of levying illegal assessments via electronic mail to fund a construction project awarded to a company owned by your brother-in-law. We have a pattern of racketeering, through your systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation to suppress dissent from homeowners. And right now, we have the illegal destruction of private property, a federal crime when it's done in retaliation and to interfere with fair housing rights. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Every one of those ridiculous fines, every threatening letter, every moment of your pathetic little surveillance operation, my brother documented it all. You didn't build a case against him, Mr. Harrison. You built one against yourself. It was over. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. Harrison's board members were being separated and questioned by agents. The demolition crew was surrendering their contracts. Harrison stood alone, his face a mess of sweat and terror. He tried to speak, mumbling about bylaws and board votes, but the words were meaningless ash in his mouth. A state trooper stepped forward and turned him around, cuffing his hands behind his back with a decisive click. The man who had wielded his petty authority like a weapon was stripped of it all in an instant, reduced to a common criminal. I watched them put him in the back of a police car, his reign of suburban tyranny ending not with a bang, but with the quiet slam of a car door. I turned back to the ruins of my home, the pain of the loss still sharp and real. My father came and stood beside me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. The triumphant roar of justice was deafening, but it couldn't completely drown out the sorrowful silence of what was lost. They had shattered my grandfather's legacy into a million pieces. But as I stood there with my family, I knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a new one. The flashing lights of the police cars painted the wreckage of my home in strobing blues and reds, creating a surreal scene of quiet, methodical investigation where chaotic destruction had just reigned. My family didn't celebrate. There was no triumphant cheering or gloating. As Harrison was driven away, a strange calm settled over the property. My father, a man accustomed to the aftermath of turmoil, began directing agents with quiet commands, ensuring the scene was preserved. My sister, her prosecutor's mask finally slipping, wrapped me in a hug that conveyed all the fear she had been hiding behind her professional fury. We stood together, the three of us, and surveyed the splintered remains of our sanctuary. The victory felt distant, an abstract concept that couldn't yet penetrate the profound, tangible loss of the physical structure. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and ruin. That night, we didn't talk about legal strategy or what would come next. We simply started to work. Under portable floodlights brought in by the state police, we began sifting through the debris, looking for anything that had survived, a scorched photograph, a piece of my grandfather's handcrafted furniture, any small anchor to our history that Harrison's rage hadn't managed to pulverize. The legal battle that followed was, in my sister's words, a foregone conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. My meticulous logs, the photos, the recordings, and the HOA's own paper trail of fraudulent invoices and sham meetings formed an airtight case. Harrison, accustomed to bullying homeowners, found himself utterly outmatched by the power of the U.S. government. His defense was a pathetic display of arrogance and delusion. He argued that the HOA bylaws gave him absolute authority, a claim the federal judge dismissed as the comical fantasy of a petty tyrant. The prosecution revealed the full extent of his corruption. The Gate project was just the beginning. He had been using fraudulent assessments and fines to line his own pockets for years, funneling contracts to family members and using the HOA's funds as his personal bank account. My defiance had threatened to expose his entire scheme, which is why he had escalated so viciously. He wasn't just trying to silence a dissenter, he was trying to eliminate a witness. After a week-long trial, the jury took less than an hour to find him guilty on all counts: wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The judge, in his sentencing, spoke of the sacred trust that communities place in their leaders and how Harrison had grotesquely violated that trust. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a sentence that ensured he would never hold power over anyone again. His board members, who had stood by and enabled his tyranny, faced their own reckoning. Two of them, in exchange for their testimony against Harrison, received lesser sentences. The others were convicted and served time. Their homes, the very assets they were trying to protect, were seized to pay the hefty fines and restitution orders. The Whispering Pines HOA was dissolved by court order, its power broken, its name now a permanent stain in the county records. With the criminal case closed, our focus shifted to civil court. We filed a lawsuit against Harrison, his convicted board members, and the HOA's insurance company, which had tried to deny the claim by arguing Harrison's actions were criminal and therefore not covered. Our lawyers argued that the board's negligence had allowed the criminality to fester, making them liable. The legal pressure was immense. Facing a mountain of evidence and the precedent of the federal conviction, the insurance company folded. We reached a settlement that was staggering. It wasn't just about the market value of the cabin. It was for the full, painstaking cost of reconstruction using period-specific materials. It covered the value of every destroyed antique, every lost heirloom, and the cost of my legal fees. But it also included a significant sum for punitive damages, a punishment for the malicious and intentional nature of their actions. The money was never the point, but it was a crucial tool. It was the fuel for the restoration, and it was the final, public declaration that what they had done was not just wrong, but costly. It sent a message to every power-tripping HOA board in the country: there are consequences. The rebuilding process took nearly a year. I cashed the settlement check and hired a team of the best local craftsmen I could find. I was there every day, not as a client, but as the lead builder. My hands, which had been clenched in impotent fury for so long, were now busy measuring, cutting, and shaping new life into the property. The act of rebuilding was cathartic. It was a slow, deliberate reclamation of my peace. News of Harrison's downfall had swept through the community, and the fear he had cultivated was gone. One by one, the old neighbors started stopping by. First, it was just to offer a word of support. Then, one Saturday, my oldest neighbor, a retired carpenter, showed up with his tool belt on and simply started helping me frame a wall. The next weekend, 2 more came. Soon, it became a community project. People who had been afraid to even speak to me were now bringing coffee, helping to paint, and clearing land. They were rebuilding their community as I was rebuilding my home. My family drove up every weekend. My father, the FBI deputy director, was surprisingly skilled with a nail gun. My sister, the fierce prosecutor, spent hours sanding floorboards until they were perfectly smooth. We were rebuilding our sanctuary, together. With the criminal case closed, our focus shifted to civil court. We filed a lawsuit against Harrison, his convicted board members, and the HOA's insurance company, which had tried to deny the claim by arguing Harrison's actions were criminal and therefore not covered. Our lawyers argued that the board's negligence had allowed the criminality to fester, making them liable. The legal pressure was immense. Facing a mountain of evidence and the precedent of the federal conviction, the insurance company folded. We reached a settlement that was staggering. It wasn't just about the market value of the cabin. It was for the full, painstaking cost of reconstruction using period-specific materials. It covered the value of every destroyed antique, every lost heirloom, and the cost of my legal fees. But it also included a significant sum for punitive damages, a punishment for the malicious and intentional nature of their actions. The money was never the point, but it was a crucial tool. It was the fuel for the restoration, and it was the final, public declaration that what they had done was not just wrong, but costly. It sent a message to every power-tripping HOA board in the country: there are consequences. The rebuilding process took nearly a year. I cashed the settlement check and hired a team of the best local craftsmen I could find. I was there every day, not as a client, but as the lead builder. My hands, which had been clenched in impotent fury for so long, were now busy measuring, cutting, and shaping new life into the property. The act of rebuilding was cathartic. It was a slow, deliberate reclamation of my peace. News of Harrison's downfall had swept through the community, and the fear he had cultivated was gone. One by one, the old neighbors started stopping by. First, it was just to offer a word of support. Then, one Saturday, my oldest neighbor, a retired carpenter, showed up with his tool belt on and simply started helping me frame a wall. The next weekend, 2 more came. Soon, it became a community project. People who had been afraid to even speak to me were now bringing coffee, helping to paint, and clearing land. They were rebuilding their community as I was rebuilding my home. My family drove up every weekend. My father, the FBI deputy director, was surprisingly skilled with a nail gun. My sister, the fierce prosecutor, spent hours sanding floorboards until they were perfectly smooth. We were rebuilding our sanctuary, together.